More will join us, but thank you for coming tonight. My name is Chris Payant. I'm the Director of Public Works. I have Derek Sari here, who's our Assistant Director, and then Rich Niles from Wood and Curran. And tonight we're going to be talking about the stormwater utility. We're going to give a brief overview and then have some opportunity for discussion. The title here, Creating a Financially Sustainable Program, I think that's important because the entire purpose for this discussion is talking not just about how we're funding things today or tomorrow, but for the long term. And I think that's a key aspect that we'll get into. So we'll kind of talk about how we got to where we are right now. Rich will get up and talk about the evaluation we did and the recommendation we have, and then we'll talk about next steps. So there's a picture here of a grade, the letter D. Many of us are familiar with the nationally, we've talked about infrastructure and in many cases is in poor state. Specifically for stormwater, it's been chronically underfunded. I'm talking nationally. So this isn't a unique thing for us here in Westboro. This is something everybody's talking about, or should be at least, and figuring out how they want to address issues they may have or issues they could foresee in the future. Typically, the infrastructure we're talking about lasts between 50 and 100 years. We're talking about putting pipes and concrete in the ground. And so generally you can get 50 to 100 years out of that, but it depends on the environment and conditions. Here in Westboro, we're looking at the average about 50 years old is what our infrastructure is looking like. So today we're just bringing awareness, answering questions, and talking about how we can continue to provide a level of service that we think the town wants. We got to this point today. This isn't just last week we started talking about this. We started talking about this several years ago as a town and discussed ways we could fund stormwater needs. And one way to do that is to look at a stormwater utility. To understand that takes some intense analysis, and to do analysis you need money because you have to hire somebody to help you do that. So about 18 months ago we were able to get a grant through the state that paid for us to hire Wood and Curran, and that's what we've been doing for the past 12 months or so, is looking at this infrastructure, looking at the possibilities and figuring out a way ahead. So that's what leads us to tonight. So I'm going to kick off just with a couple of brief points on our need and what we have in town, and then Rich will pick up the discussion about the evaluation. So this slide represents so this is data, a snapshot from our asset data collection mechanism. So we go out in the field and we locate all these things, we put in a little tablet, it shows up on this screen. So all these yellow lines and dots up here represent infrastructure. These are things in the ground that collect and treat our stormwater. So this is just one street, about a dozen houses. This dot up here is generally where that street is, and you can see that we're only talking about one little street in town. Multiply this by the many miles of streets we have, and you've got a big number. And so,
when you say treat, do you mean let it settle in a detention pond?
Yep, so these squares here represent catch basins. Those are drains in the street that you see. That's where the rain flows in, the stormwater flows into. There's a sump typically in the bottom. That's where sediment drops, and then the water eventually makes its way out, flows through pipes, and then eventually makes it out to an area where it's discharged. And this is a routine thing for us to go out and maintain these structures, clean them, make sure there's no debris blocking them, that sort of thing. And the consequence here is if we don't do this, then the structures don't work, and that water that you're hoping is going somewhere is going in your streets, and in some cases making them impassable. So that's the value of our stormwater infrastructure, is that it's removing this water, it's treating this water, and it's putting it in a place where it needs to be and not disrupting our ability to move around the town. So this slide really talks to kind of daily operations, what we do typically. This is really going to get into some of the longer term things we have to do, which is take care of the bigger infrastructure we have and replace it over time. So 2 examples here on the left side speaks to an assessment we did this past summer on our culverts around the town. And we looked at 155 of them assessed. Many of them are beyond their useful life. We looked at the top 20 that need to be replaced, and we're looking at a dollar amount of about $3.5 million to do that. That's only 20 out of 155, and that number is probably on the low side because the number is based on just taking a pipe out of the ground and putting a new one in place. But potentially there's many of these pipes were installed a long time ago, and so conditions have changed, permitting requirements have changed, so we might need to install something that's different than what exists right now. So that could drive our costs up. On the right side is a study that we did several years ago that speaks to our metal pipe. So the yellow lines we showed on the previous slide, those are typically metal pipe, and they age, corrode over time, and eventually have to be replaced. So we looked at about 25,000 feet of pipe, close to 7,000 feet of it need to be corrected, replaced, repaired in some manner. That 25,000 is out of 300,000 feet of pipe that exist around the town that need to be maintained. So just to fix this, 7,000 feet of pipe or so, we're talking close to $3 million, and that's only a fraction of what we need to do. And so we have these requirements out there. We know we need to fix them. If we don't fix them, then we're going to have consequences such as roads being closed or whatever the case may be, which obviously we don't want, and we certainly want to avoid that. But you look at those top 20 culverts, if you just replaced one culvert a year, you're talking 20 years to replace 20, and we have 155. Actually, we have over 200. We just couldn't assess 48 of them because they were underwater, which isn't good in and of itself. So the point today is really to talk about how do we know how to do this work, it's how do we want to pay for it. And there are a couple of ways to do that, and we're going to bring those to you tonight and have a discussion about it. Over to you.
Yep. All right, good evening. My name is Rich Niles. I'm a project manager with Woodard & Kern. We were hired by the town to help guide through this process. I've done this with about 3 dozen communities in New England, and it's really intended to have an engagement with the public, present results of the study that we completed, and act as a guide to the town to help make good decisions and informed decisions about how you want to fund your program and at what level. So when we look at we look at the stormwater program as a whole, we're trying to create a more cohesive program concept where we have good planning, we've done some assessment, we understand needs enough to know some of our top priorities, and in every community that does this, they immediately identify a funding gap. And so what we look at is what are the big elements where the gap lies. A lot of it is capital expenditure to replace infrastructure. In some cases, upgrade that infrastructure. In other instances, we may need to look at water quality issues. So we looked at what we call several program categories, operations and maintenance, administrative, the inspections, things that we need to do. When you build new things and replace things and have more activity, it's a higher demand upon town staff, and sometimes you also need outside resources. When we look at the sort of the initial horizon, we try to frame what we think is an average need, an expenditure that's appropriate. Because the program is new in terms of the level of expenditure in some of those projects, it typically will grow. So we looked at this closely with the town staff, and we've reviewed this with the select board and the AFC to come to what we think is a reasonable starting point of a $1.5 million program. And that's going to fund a lot of these projects and also allow us to leverage that money for future projects and planning. So when we look at, well, how do we get that money on a regular basis and have a dedicated revenue stream? Well, we can request the money as we do for capital projects at town meeting, and so it's through taxes. These are projects that aren't on the books yet. So DPW's budget doesn't accommodate this level for stormwater management activities. So these are unmet needs. And so communities look at, well, traditional business approach is tax increase. And it's challenging because it competes with other interests and priorities within the community. And you have to make sure you get that money every year to have a program where it's more sustainable and less reactive. A stormwater utility is a program concept that a lot of communities have looked to because it has several advantages over a tax increase. And so I'll try to hit upon some of those now, and hopefully that becomes a little more clear as we move along. But one thing is these are dedicated funds. So it goes into an enterprise account like a water and sewer account, and that money is used for that activity specifically. However, within that, there's some level of flexibility. So we're trying to craft a program that we think is reasonable and adequate, and it allows us to put it into a dedicated fund so that DPW uses it for that, and it doesn't have to compete directly every year with the general fund. And we can use that in a variety of ways. So if we have a lot of capital, high priority projects, but something else comes up, we can shift and use the money in different ways for still stormwater activities, but there's some flexibility built into that. And there's flexibility in the finance strategy, so we have dedicated revenue, we can take that and pledge it for debt service on a bond. So we can do it on cash flow, or we can do it on bonding. Either way, the money is there to be able to exercise those options. A lot of people see it as a more equitable approach, and I'll talk about the equity a bit more on the next slide, and sort of the rationale as to how you charge a fee for stormwater for individual properties. One last thing is there is another benefit in that Water Management Act is a requirement for the town for groundwater withdrawal for drinking water purposes. So it is challenging to meet those requirements, and from an administrative regulatory standpoint, this program would allow the town to get more credit. So it helps your overall water resource management program and those approvals. There are other benefits that we'll talk about a little bit, some of which are credits. So if you do stormwater management well on your own property through a stormwater utility, you can get a credit. It's like saying, well, I'm doing my part, but there's some part of it that is borne by the public system, and that's really what we're paying for here. So there's an opportunity to do that, which you can't do through taxes. So there's several advantages, and I certainly want to entertain questions on that if you're not sure about that.
Can I ask one, so does that mean that the newer McMansion neighborhoods and big apartment complexes that have detention infrastructure don't have to pay?
No. So one thing, just as a matter of process, I know that this is being recorded and broadcast, so I want to make sure that the questions come through. And we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And so I'll answer your question though still, is that credits, yes, there is some discount credit. However, this is to pay for the public system. So even if you manage stormwater well on your property, you still use the public system. So it doesn't mean you don't have to pay a bill. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you're jumping ahead, but it's okay. So I just want to talk about the fundamental approach to stormwater utilities. So the majority of utilities that exist in the country, and there's over 2,500 of them, have what we call a rate methodology, where we look at what is the true driver for stormwater management. Why do we have to capture it, collect it, and treat it? And it's largely because of development, right? A forest even has runoff, but pavement has the most. The water does not penetrate it. It's an unnatural surface, so it has to be managed. So pavement is the best indicator of a property's overall stormwater runoff in terms of the volume that comes off it and water quality issues associated with pollutants. So when we think of, well, how do we differentiate between different levels of sort of impact or use of the system, because runoff from properties eventually goes to some public infrastructure. The impervious area, which is the rooftop, the driveway, sidewalk, it's the most appropriate way to look at your impact. And so it's a good surrogate to measure. Just like we have for water and sewer, we measure your water at a meter, but we don't have meters for stormwater for your property. So we look at impervious area as a surrogate to measure, and we can measure that with aerial imagery very well. And we've done that for this project. And so when we look at, who contributes the most runoff, well, large properties or properties with a large amount of impervious area contribute a lot more. So runoff isn't associated with property value. There's not a very good correlation to that. There's a better correlation to impervious area. So that's the kind of basic understand or rationale between your impact on the system and what we think is an appropriate way to assess a fee. So we kind of start there, then we look at the properties across the community, and the single-family residential properties represent the majority of the total number of parcels. However, and that's the pie chart on the left. So you look at the total number, you got 80% are single family, but they don't have the majority of the impervious area. The non-residential properties do. So when we think of who pays, well, the people who pay the most are the ones that are contributing the most runoff typically. Just like if you use the most water, you pay a higher bill for your water use. So that's the kind of basic methodology, but then we look at it closer and say, okay, well, single family properties seem similar, but they're not all the same. So there's an opportunity to recognize differences in properties, even at the residential level. And so a lot of communities have chosen to look at that closer and say, well, a really small property, should we really charge them the same as a really large property? And what seems to be fair? Some use a flat rate and say if you're single family, you get one rate. When we went through this with the town, we looked at multiple rate structures and we looked at other communities, and a tiered rate structure seemed appropriate. So this is a histogram that is showing kind of different buckets that represent small, medium, large. And so the height of it indicates the number of properties that fall within that range of impervious area. So the average or typical is about 4,200 square feet. And that's, again, your impervious area only. It's not your lot size or your square foot of your home. It's the impervious area. So we looked at the distribution, and in Westboro, in most communities, you have a distribution and it follows a curve. And we recognize that there's some really large impervious area residential properties that we may want to recognize differently, and they would have a higher fee. And again, these are preliminary rate analyses that these things are subject to change. We can modify them, and there's a lot of different ways to look at this. What we typically don't do is go down to, say, the square foot or even the 100 square feet, because the data is just not good enough and it doesn't make a difference in the end, a significant difference in what you might get billed. So there's this is sort of the data behind the rate approach. And what we did is we did a preliminary analysis of fees based upon those three tiers. So if I look at, hold on one second, let me get my pointer. So if you look at the first tier here, and this is showing the number of parcels, the number of billing units, and we take that $1.5 million program and we divide it by billing units, and we come up with a cost per billing unit for that first category, and that's how we came up with $57, roughly. And again, these are not exact values. These are really for illustrating the concept, but this is in the range of what a fee would be for a home that has is in that first tier, which is the, I'm sorry, go to the next. That's the up to 4,000 square feet was that first tier. And so you can see the rates so on here, and then all other properties are a multiple of that tier 1 category. So if you've got a small home and a large business parking lot, and the parking lot's 10 times the impervious area of the small home, well, they're gonna get 10 times the bill. So that's how we look at other properties. And again, there's lots of different rate structures and methodologies, but these are ones that are very similar and common to what's in Massachusetts and other states. So just to illustrate that a different way, and hopefully this is a little bit more visually appealing than the table, is to look at different size homes, what do they pay? And again, we can do further rate analysis, and that's really part of next steps if this is something the town wants to continue to pursue. A rate study, a final rate study would be needed. But this is just to give you a snapshot of what that looks like. So when we look at other communities in Massachusetts, about 24 utilities that exist, and about half of those have been formed in the last 5 years. So there's a growing demand for stormwater improvements and need that everybody's recognizing. And they're also looking at a stormwater utility as a funding mechanism to best meet those needs for now and in the future. So we look at other communities nearby, sort of the dashboard communities that Westboro typically looks at. What are our neighbors doing? What do their programs look like? What we're looking at for a starting point with Westboro is similar to where other communities have started recently. Franklin is sending out bills in July. So they just recently established their utility. I worked with Franklin to help them with that approach. For the typical residential property, it's around $60, around what you guys are looking at. But for other properties, it's also higher. So that's just kind of the typical. And you look at Shrewsbury and Westford, different programs, they're funding slightly different activities, but relative order, similar order of magnitude. And the fees per year are generally in line, more or less, for the residential properties with what we're looking at. So one thing we want to do is just kind of summarize some of the work and the takeaways so far with the work that, with the study. And this is information, kind of what's been discussed with the select board, town staff. So there's a recognition that there's a need for additional funding, and we think that program looks like it's an additional $1.5 million annually. There's general agreement that the stormwater utility makes sense and that it's worth pursuing, and it has multiple benefits over a tax increase. And there's support for a tiered rate approach, as I showed, that seems to make sense, but those things can be modified and adjusted as well. When we get into the fine details, we want to consider properties that are impacted differently. Tax exempt properties wouldn't receive a bill for under a tax bill, but they'd receive a stormwater bill now. So we want to look at the impacts to individual properties and some of the larger properties as well, not just residential. So there's a lot of things that can be done to adjust it. So rate structure is flexible, and we can look at it in a few different ways, and then we can also do rate modifiers and other things. But this is kind of a starting point, and this generally seemed to make sense as a place to start. And that was the feedback from town staff and boards. And so there's general support to consider a warrant article to bring before town meeting, and two articles actually, one of which would be a bylaw to establish authority to implement this fee. It doesn't mean you send out a bill right away. It just means that we want to continue to pursue this, and we've agreed that this makes sense, knowing that we got to work through a lot of fine details. The other part of that is another article for establishing the account and funding the implementation phase to actually put it in place and send out bills. And some of that money would be for hiring a consultant to develop the database, work through the details, but it's a one-time cost. So those are the two articles that are before town meeting. And now the next slide really talks more about sort of the steps. So there's a lot of steps involved. I mentioned the two articles, and then as part of that implementation phase, that $150,000, and that's a budget, and that's for a variety of activities. There's typically, there's a continuous public engagement process. We need to do a final rate study, craft that program. Is it still 1.5 million? We think that that's a right place to start. I've had communities say, well, we'd like to be more aggressive because we have more problems we'd like to solve faster. That's not the norm to say, charge me more money. However, I've seen it happen. And so there's ways to look at the program and fine tune those, and that's what we'll continue to do. And there's public input process along the way for that. There's some mechanics. We need to look at, additional policies. How often do we update data? You're not going to change your bill every year. We don't do that. We look at it, do an analysis. Unless your property changes, we don't change that. But we have to say, well, maybe we revisit that every 2 to 3 years. So there's kind of fine details with the program that need to be ironed out, and things like credits, like I mentioned, that's an important aspect, and we can talk about that a bit more. And then ultimately, we have to develop a billing account file. There's some administration to just set it up. But this is the general schedule that we're estimating is the funding wouldn't be available until authorized at town meeting, to then begin implementation steps, which would then take anywhere from 12 to 12 plus months. So this is a kind of conceptual time frame. So we're looking at second quarter potentially of 2024 when bills would actually go out. So just to put that into perspective, not just from a process standpoint of when you might see those things, But DPW has needs, and we're talking about unmet needs, and the revenue to support and start solving those problems and doing projects isn't going to come for 12 to 18 months. So we do need to think about, how do we get moving in the right direction? It takes time to do that. And there's a process that's going to occur. What's before you at town meeting is a bylaw to start that process and the authorized funding, excuse me, to continue to vet and fine tune this information. So with that, I'll just kind of turn it over to you guys for questions. And if you have questions, if you could come up to the microphone and speak. I know or I could pass it around. I know it's very formal, but we're trying to make sure that the audience at home that might be watching can benefit from that as well. So I know that's a lot to digest at once. There is a lot of information on the website. There's a fact sheet. There's additional materials. There's examples and links to other communities. We had a nice turnout this afternoon with several people that came and asked a lot of great questions, had done their homework, but still had a lot of questions to work through it. And so this is something that we want your feedback. We want to understand your concerns. And there's additional information that we can make available as well leading up to town meeting.
Yeah, can you go back one slide? Yeah, so when you're talking about Q3 and Q4, are you talking about our fiscal quarters, or are you talking about calendar quarters there?
Calendar.
Calendar, okay, so
That's a
Q3. 6-month difference. So you're talking Q2 2024 being March through June as opposed to September through December.
So ultimately, what we're doing is, if we worked off this timeline, we would try to align it with the next budget cycle. So this would be
That's what I was
essentially
looking at.
July of 2024.
But the town meeting for the July of 2024, I mean, we're doing it now, so, right, the choices have to be made by then. Yeah, but, so you're talking about fiscal 25.
Yes, fiscal 25.
Yeah, these slides will be available if you're interested. We'll post them. I think we're going to post these on the website, right? Yeah. Don't be shy.
This is my first engagement on this topic, so
Yeah.
if my questions are kind of naive, please forgive me. I'm more familiar in Boston with the stormwater issues. Are stormwater street drains and pipes separate from the sanitary sewer?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's a really good thing. Okay. I can imagine every department in the town would like their own dedicated source of revenue so they don't have to be prioritized with all the other priorities within the town. So I'm a little ambivalent on that. But that being said, I totally understand why we're doing this. I totally understand why it's necessary. And, I'll probably be supportive of it. When evaluating the impervious surface on a house lot or a commercial property, will we be taking into account the impervious surface lot coverage ratio, or is 3,000 square feet of house and driveway 3,000 square feet, whether you have a 0.2 acre lot or whether you have a 2 acre lot? Can you help me understand that?
Yeah. So what you're getting at, which is looking at what is your property impact as a whole, because impervious isn't the only thing that creates runoff, right? Like I said, a forest creates runoff to some extent, not much. We generally focus on developed areas, and so we don't build somebody for a field. We build people for things that impede natural flow of precipitation to infiltrate and run off in a natural way. Some communities have chosen to go to what is called a gross area assessment. So you look at the gross area of the parcel and use a factor of that in addition to your impervious area. So you have an impervious plus gross. So there are some utilities that exist in New England and the country that are just based on your parcel, which the only reason that is because the data didn't exist for impervious area.
Yeah.
You'd have to go out and measure it physically on your property. Now we have technology and aerial imagery that allows us to automate that process. So
I've left most of my parcel in woodlands so that it will absorb the water coming down. And
So some communities see that as a benefit, right? That's you're preserving that. Others say, well, it still generates runoff, so you should pay something. And so there's varying philosophies, but it does exist. It's not very common.
But this approach that we're talking tonight is purely a measurement of the impervious area on your property, regardless of the size of your property.
Got it.
And that's what your bill is based on.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you.
Yep. I mean, Derek knows I'm on the northwest side of Fay Mountain, so our water goes down the street into the 100-acre Libby property. So there's not a lot of infrastructure. It just goes out there, and there's plenty of room to absorb that. But thank you. I appreciate the help.
You know, and one thing this budget would be also used for, you know, knowing the area on the west side, we still have tremendous amount of flooding down at K Street and West Main Street where this eventually discharges. So even though there's still tremendous amount of undeveloped land, whether it's New England Forestry and Libby, as well as other areas in that general area, we still have problems. So this would look at potentially even putting detention basins on town-owned property to detain that water prior to getting to K Street and then prior to getting to one of the top 5 culverts that need to be replaced at West Main Street. And that's what this budget would be used for.
And that's a discussion point we had this afternoon. We've talked a lot about maintaining things or fixing things that might be broken, and that's certainly part of this discussion. But if we have something that's broken and we're going to go fix it, it may result in a different solution that includes adding other structures like what Derek just mentioned, a detention basin or something else, because the conditions have changed over the 30 or 40, 50 years that structure existed, and what developed around it has changed, but the infrastructure didn't change. And so we need to modify that infrastructure to account for these changes. But that's where the cost comes in, because you're now adding infrastructure to your town as opposed to just replacing. So your bill is not a one-for-one cost. It could be double, you know?
Yeah.
What?
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I'm sure you're thinking about questions, so I'll talk a little bit while you're thinking about them. Just to state again the next immediate steps for us. So we go to town meeting, we have town meeting in March, and at the town meeting, we'll be back up again, and we will propose 2 articles. So the first article will be to propose a bylaw that is printed back there on the table that some of you grabbed, that will give the authorization to the town to establish this fund. It means we have the ability to do it if we want to. There's no money in it. We haven't asked for any money to be put in it. It just exists. We have it. The second article is for implementation. So all those steps up there that are in red bullets, those things still need to be done. And so if the town says, yes, we vote to establish this bylaw, then we would go to the next article and ask for $150,000, which is a budgetary number. May not cost us $150,000, but that's what we're budgeting, to go through the steps to establish this fund. And those steps include setting the rates. So we showed some rates earlier for typical residential housing. And those rates will probably be in that ballpark. It may not be exactly $56 that it said. It could be 55 or 62, but it's going to be something close to that. And that process happens, and the way the bylaw lays it out is that the select board ultimately approves those rates. And in that process, so that big long arrow there that says public engagement, there'll be opportunity for people to voice their opinions on those rates, whether they should go up or down, or, you know, how we want to modify them. But I'm just trying to make the point that the town meeting vote doesn't mean you're getting a bill in the mail. It just means we're committing to pursuing this option. The alternative is for us to spend more money doing more data collection, analysis, and that sort of thing, and presenting more things to the community, and potentially moving forward with a lot of this. And then when we get to the end, we come ask if you want it, and you say no, and then we just spent a whole lot of money on something that resulted in nothing for us. So our approach is recommending that we get some commitment up front, and then we pursue the details that are listed here.
Yeah, just to speak a little bit to the enterprise account, like, yeah, we'd all like to have one, and for other services, and some communities do. They do it for trash. You know, town of Agawam has a golf course enterprise fund. You know, so it's similar. So we're starting to recognize stormwater as its own utility, and it's demanding a level of service that the general fund has historically not kept up with. And one of the other benefits that we didn't talk too much about is the ability to leverage outside funding. Stormwater utility provides seed money as well, so we can take some of that money and match it for grant funds, and there's lots of opportunities out there to do so. But if we can't plan and rely upon those 12 to 18 months out, we can't pledge money. We don't have dedicated money for debt service. And the town can handle debt service in a variety of ways through the general fund too, through capital appropriations. But utilities generally attract outside funding sources because most agencies want to see that you have a well thought out program. You've set aside money and dedicated money, and it's not dependent upon annual vote. You know, so they are more willing and interested in supporting programs that have established that, and they know that their money is going to go further because you can leverage your existing enterprise account. So, and that's something we help communities with, is help to leverage those outside funding sources. So that 1.5, we can take that and leverage more and build a reserve for larger projects or for things that are unanticipated that happen. You know, we have reserve accounts and utility revenues for things like water and sewer because when they break, we got to be able to fix them. Stormwater doesn't scream as loud as a broken sewer pipe or a water main, but at some point, like Chris said, the road has to be closed. We don't have the money to actually pay for a $500,000 culvert repair. In some instances. So I just wanted to emphasize that is another, you know, key benefit of having a revenue stream. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I just had a clarifying question about the rate setting. Does the select board approve just the initial rates, or do they approve the rate every year?
The select board approves the rates and then any rate adjustments.
Okay, so it would be
Yes.
essentially every year?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if there's a change.
Yep, it's a change. All right.
But that actually is a good point. Can you flip back to that chart with the rates on it? The one before that? So, no, the one, sorry, at the beginning. Keep going back. This one, so, Rich, I'm sitting because the mic's down here. So the three columns there, 24, 25, 26, so you can see, like the intent was to try to get something that's consistent. Like we don't want to set a rate this year and then already come back to you next year with a rate increase. So we're trying to, you know, propose something that's going to give a little bit of predictability for at least a couple of years before we'd have to consider even changing rates or raising them.
Right.
Yeah, so this is what we think is a necessary or an appropriate revenue stream or a budget that the revenue would come through consistently each year to match that. But how we spend the money is different. So we can have a funding strategy within the enterprise account that says, okay, well, you can see the numbers start to climb with capital, because we started to incorporate, there's a lot of background to this, and we have detail to support that we thought through. And so there's new projects that need to come, that will need to be done over time. And obviously there's some consideration for inflation. But we could say, well, we want to continue to set the rates, continue to keep the same rate for year, FY27, FY28, et cetera. We want to continue to level fund it. It's been successful. A lot of the communities look at that and say, well, we do have growing capital need, but we're now going to take $250,000 from what we were spending every year and leverage that for debt service on a municipal bond. So now we can do 5 more projects and bond those for the next 15 years with that $250,000. So we continue to advance our program and accomplish goals, but we finance it differently. And we have the money to do so and have that flexibility to do so. So some communities will want to level fund it as long as possible, and there's ways to be able to manage that. But because we're starting at a pretty significant backlog, we know it's going to grow over time, and this is our reasonable starting point. It takes time to design projects and get them built, and there's this capacity that the town can handle. We can't just all of a sudden spend $10 million next year and build projects and start ripping up streets everywhere. So we do want to manage those priorities and have something that's manageable. And there's not many DPWs that would complain about getting more funding, but we want to make sure we use it wisely and we use it effectively to get work done and have actual benefits, so you can see those tangible benefits.
This is less of a question than an idea, but I think it'd be useful, particularly for town meeting, to have a summary chart of, we've been paying for stormwater infrastructure through the taxes always right now. That's what we do. We do articles, and we also do it through the DPW budget. But I think it'd be useful to show that. Like in this Warren article set, we do have some stormwater things too. So I think that'd be a good illustration to see we are spending this money. It's a different funding method, but it's not like we're spending nothing now and we're adding $1.5 million a year. It's really, we probably have to have been spending that, I would guess. But
Yes.
it'd be nice to have that
Yep.
data.
Sure. That's a good point.
So following with that, I just wanted to know how long it would be before this fund would fully cover the cost of the infrastructure that we have to repair. So like you said, we're already paying for it through taxes. And I'm assuming there's going to be some kind of overlap where we're still paying taxes, but we're also paying into this fund because it doesn't cover the infrastructure that we have to replace. Like Chris said, we have 20 culverts that need to be replaced now, and that's clearly not going to be covered by this fund. So when do you see this fund fully kind of covering stormwater management?
So the intent is that if we were to establish this and fund it, that from the get-go, it's paying for, like, we wouldn't be coming back to the town. We wouldn't ask for $1.5 million through this and then go ask for more money from the town out of the budget. Everything would be funded out of the Stormwater Enterprise Fund from the beginning.
Okay, my second question is there someplace where an individual property owner can go and see where their impervious area is?
Yes. Current, like today, you could go to the town website, the main page, there's a link to the town, I forget the title of it, but basically a map. And it shows the imagery of the town. You could go to your parcel. There's a tool that allows you to measure area, and you could draw a box around your roof, and it would tell you the square footage of your roof, and you could measure a box around your driveway or your patio, add that up, and that would tell you how much square footage you have on your property.
Rich, I know this is more on this is more for the implementation phase, but when a bill does go out, when you look at other communities, does it actually list the impervious of that particular parcel?
Yeah,
when it goes out?
Yeah, it's up to the community. So a lot of times they'll list the number of billing units or the billing category. You can choose to do that. We have the data. So, there is a measured value. So it might be 4,125 square feet. Is it really 4,125 or is it 4,127 or is it 44,000? So there's always going to be some margin of error based upon the quality of the data and the resolution. And that's another reason why we put things into kind of chunkier categories, and we don't look at every square foot because you're always going to be wrong. And so and this was talked about a lot at this afternoon's meeting, is that exact question is, can I see what mine's going to be? Because everybody's curious. And businesses will be curious too, because there's businesses in town that have 1 million square feet of impervious. So it just in your head, do the math, it's a lot, right? So that we can present that information in a variety of ways. I've seen a lot of communities where, once we create the rate structure in the billing database, we can then incorporate that into a GIS viewer pretty simply, so you can click on it and see your bill. So it's not as much calculations, but to Chris's point, like today, you can measure that right now. As part of implementation, we can better address that, so it's more clear and simpler. And people, I think a lot of people just they want to know, like, okay, well, I see the range, but where do I fall? And we actually had, I've had people say, well, it's not a lot of money, but to some people it is. So we have to be cognizant of that. And but it is important to understand the process and be transparent. And we have real data that we can share. You can come to every meeting if you like, and I'll talk all day long about it. But unfortunately, the challenge is not everybody has that amount of time. So we try to make it digestible and give it to people in bite sizes. And so the feedback and questions is helpful for us to, message that information properly, because we just can't cover everything. So.
Again, I appreciate why we're doing this, and I think it's necessary. I do get worried about requests for funding and isolation of everything else. And so, Chris, when you think about how urgent this priority is and compare it to keeping our sewer system compliant and our water infrastructure system compliant, are we on the right path with those so that this doesn't get followed up next by, oh my goodness, the sewer needs a whole bunch of money. Oh, the water needs a whole bunch of money. Where does this fit?
The difference is that water and sewer already has its own funds.
Yeah.
So each one, there's a water enterprise fund, so very similar to this.
Yeah.
And there's a sewer enterprise fund, very similar to this. So that already exists. And so I guess that reinforces in my mind the value of this particular fund, because now you have your water, your sewer, and your stormwater. It's funded, but it's funded specifically for that activity, and there's no temptation to say, this year we will do it, but next year we're gonna spend that money somewhere else.
Okay. Again, about the issue of isolation, it's my understanding that that dump is closing and we're going to get hit with fees for trash collection that we've never had to worry about. Do we know what those are going to be?
No. Yes, we're aware that the station is closing access to residents next year, but I don't know. And that there's a process to figure that out, but I don't know what that outcome will be.
Okay. I have to finance these kind of infrastructure for my employer, so I get it. Just encourage, let's minimize the administration, the consulting, the engineering, and spend the money on the stuff in the ground. It was my plea. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that is a common concern. Like, you want to see things get done. This is we're doing more work, so there's some level of increased personnel need, and some of that can be handled, through a new staff person. There's an internal capacity that everybody has an existing job. Yeah, no. It's a great point though. But we're not trying to create bureaucracy here. It's a funding mechanism just to do more work, essentially.
So we've been here about an hour. We'll wrap up unless there's more questions. I'll make a final comment, which is just that the point of, when we started this, the title was about sustainable financing, and I think that, to me, that's the important thing we need to think about when we make a choice as to which road we want to go down. And we just mentioned it. There's this, it sounds like, right, we put up a slide, we show a road where the culvert's washed away and, you know, the road's closed, and everybody says, we got to fix this stuff right now. And that kind of creates this mindset that there's disaster, you know, out there waiting to happen. And so we just want to, like, we're not trying to scare anybody into this. We just, but the requirements are every year. They're not like maybe this year we can get by with a few dollars and then skip a few years. It's every year because we have, as we said, you know, 200 culverts. And if we just do, let's say we do 4 a year, you know, that's whatever that is, 50 years is going to take us to replace those culverts. And so, like, this is for the long haul. And we if we continue to do this, where this year we fund it, but next year we don't, and then we're just probably not going to get where we need to get to. And
You got to get to a place where you're doing preventive maintenance, not chasing crises.
right, and so we're just suggesting that this is a way to do that, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for more discussion. You can always, you know, if you leave here and you have questions, or if there's anybody watching this, you can always call us at the DPW, and we'll be happy to talk about it. And you know, we'll continue to publish more information between now and town meeting, and then we'll come to town meeting, have a discussion, and decide which direction we want to go.
We appreciate your openness and willingness to answer questions.
You're welcome.
So thank you for coming.